Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Orchard Cast. I'm your host, Jeremy Appel, speaking to you from a piece of Treaty 6 territory you may know as Edmonton. Today, we've got Carmen Celestini on the program. Carmen is a lecturer at the University of Waterloo's Department of Religious Studies and a researcher with the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. But most importantly, for our purposes, she's the author of a relatively new book, God's Angry Men: The Political Legacy of the John Birch Society. In it, she draws a direct link from the John Birch Society's embrace of free market fundamentalism, religious social conservatism, and anti-communist conspiracy theorizing in the modern populist right embodied by US President Donald Trump and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, among many others. Carmen will join us momentarily, but first, I'm going to ask you for some money. Doing the work that I do takes a lot of time and effort, which I'm not always compensated for. If you'd like to see me continue fulfilling this niche in Canadian journalism and have the means, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. I'd like to believe it's worth it, but don't just take my word for it. Paid supporter Florence Dreger says she believes the causes I deal with are important for all Canadians to understand and not just know about. Thanks, Florence. That's an interesting distinction you make between knowing and understanding. Anyways, let's get on with the show. Carmen Celestini, welcome to the Orchard Cast.
Thank you for having me.
You've recently published a book about the John Birch Society called God's Angry Men, which is a great title.
Thank you.
I know that comes from the writings of Robert Welch, who co-founded the society, or JBS, as I might be calling it, throughout this conversation. But I guess to start, maybe I'll ask a question that is probably obvious and at risk of sounding lazy. Could you tell us a bit about what is the John Birch Society? Because I was telling a couple of people that I was reading your book about the John Birch Society, and they were like, "What's that?" And I was like, well, it's this organization that was anti-communist and believed in conspiracy theories. And I don't know if that quite does it justice. So you, as the expert in the JBS here, what is the JBS?
Well, I don't think you're wrong in sort of what you said. That is a public persona of the John Birch Society, right? It was an organization that rose up. It started in 1958, and it was to create an anti-communist movement. There were other ones, but they were very Christian-oriented. It was already in their titles. But this was something that came out that was in the public eye, a non-denominational, non-religious organization that was anti-communism. But beneath that were very powerful rich men who were organizing what they called the so-called middle class to mobilize behind Barry Goldwater. Now, they were very right-wing. They were very useful for religious hierarchy, religious language. and they used endless amounts of conspiracy theories. Now, if a lot of people look up the John Birch Society, what they're going to find is that Robert Welch, the founder of it, was most well known for saying that President Eisenhower was a communist sympathizer and a supporter. And that really got them sort of dismissed. But during Goldwater's run and lead up to his campaign and the actual election, the John Birch Society were foundational in getting him his nomination and for sort of shaping the conversation. Everyone had to respond to them. After the election, they sort of disappeared, but they still exist to this day. You can still find them on social media platforms sharing conspiracy theories and right wing thoughts.
And as you outline in the book, the John Birch Society was at the height of its political influence in the 1960s with Barry Goldwater's failed Republican presidential campaign. The way I found out about the John Birch Society was actually through the song Talking John Birch Paranoid Blues by Bob Dylan, where there's that line where he mentioned, Eisenhower, he's a Russian spy. Lincoln Jefferson in that Roosevelt guy. These were things they actually believed that like communists had infiltrated the American government at the highest levels. I wanted to ask you, why is the time right for a reexamination of the JBS's conspiracy inflected right-wing populism?
Well, because we sort of think that, those of us who know what the John Birch Society is, and I'm actually the opposite of you. I didn't know about Bob Dylan's song until I actually started researching, and I was like, oh, there's a song. But it's important because this is a movement that started earlier than the actual founding of the John Birch Society, right? And it was very wealthy men who were looking for power. They were looking for political power, what they called a conservative messiah to lead the GOP in America for free enterprise, for God, and to ensure what they wanted happened. So they were fighting for what they believe is their American inheritance. And it's important because when the John Birch Society sort of disappeared, people just thought after 1965 that that was the end of that, and they've sort of disappeared. They were actually the catalyst to so many things. Individuals, including all of the rich people who were funders for it, they didn't just stop thinking, I'm not going to try and control American politics anymore. So they tried a lot of different things to control that political movement. And so the most successfuls that they had were the moral majority in America, that movement that got Ronald Reagan elected. They started something called, not Jimmy Carter, but that was obviously in my brain, Ronald Reagan to take out Jimmy Carter. They started the Council for National Policy, which is one of the most powerful organizations in America when it comes to politics. And they also started the Heritage Foundation. With that, they also work very closely with media, right-wing media, alternative media, and well-known media, and spread this idea while working with conservative religious groups as well through the CMP and through the Heritage Foundation. And so what these people envisioned in the 1940s and 1950s has come to fruition. We have, the social conservatism ideas that they want that are anti-LGBTQ, anti-women, the conservative messiah in Donald Trump. And I think that when we look at politics now, we dismiss this idea and we think, well, it comes from here, or it comes from there, and it comes from there. And we don't see it as a cohesive movement that has worked together, providing fear, conspiracy theories, right-wing radio, talk radio, the online movements. All of this is really important to where we are today and to understand how people are mobilized, how God, conspiracy theories, and politics come together in defining who is an American and who isn't. When we see this cleavage and polarization happening in America, it's not something that, people point back to the Tea Party or they point back to other point in time, Reaganomics, they point back to that. But this is something that's longstanding. And I think analysis of our history can help us understand this moment that we're in now, and not necessarily how to solve it, but maybe how to ensure that we can end it in some way while not letting it happen again.
And to what extent were the changes of the civil rights movement and the Voting Rights Act in the early 1960s a catalyst for this right-wing mobilization in defense of family and freedom and all these sort of right-wing touchstones that you see today.
It was foundational. I mean, I think that while this was happening, the John Birch Society and many of the groups that were organizing with them believed that MLK, they believed he went to communism school. They actually sent out flyers and pictures that had pictures of him in a communist classroom, learning how to be a communist and change the world. That the entire movement had nothing to do with rights for them. It was really about how to destroy free enterprise and capitalism in America. And so it really took away the agency of the individuals who were part of the movement. It took away any acknowledgement and accountability for what America had done through systemic policies and ideas in America. But it also was a catalyst to saving what is mine, right? This is this idea that not only are civil rights or women's rights going to take away what's mine in America and my American dream, but it's something I have to fight against. And so they put Goldwater up as saying that he was the one who voted against, the voting rights and civil rights while he was in government. But, his actual personal life was very different. At the stores that he owned in Arizona, prior to the civil rights movement, they actually provided health care to their employees. They actually had equal rights in the store, regardless of ethnicity, or if you were a person of color, you got paid the same amount. So the practice that he had within his own state and his own properties and stores was very different than what he was articulating to those who were following him as this messiah of conservatism. And so they often, the John Birch Society, used people of color who were part of their speakers bureau, who declared that the civil rights movement was really communism and an attack on America, and that people of color didn't want to be a part of this, and that they were being duped by communism. And so the John Birch Society saw communism infiltrating every aspect of society, right? Every institution, the church, media, academia, everything. And so this was a concerted effort that nothing was happening by chance. People weren't fighting for their rights or for equality. It was because they were being forced to do it or they were being duped. And so that really changed the idea of what was happening in society for these individuals. Many were really afraid, and that's generally what is the most important part of any conspiracy theory, right? Is fear and understanding why there's changes happening. And when, they were saying there were riots on the streets and they were seeing, protests, and they were seeing all these things happening, it couldn't be because America needed to change or something was wrong, because it was predominantly white, middle-class people who were members. It was because they were being used and they were trying to destroy the nation. So it explained what was happening around them, and this idea that they were being oppressed because of what was happening. Very similar to what we see happening in 2026 as well.
Right. And I think there's always been a strain of that in conservatism, this revanchist, we've lost and we're taking it back. Right. Corey Robin, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but in his book, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump, talks about how, going back to Edmund Burke, right? Yeah. Conservatism was always about restoring elite power to the extent possible given existing realities. But what I think might have made the John Birch Society an innovator of sorts is this embrace of conspiracy theories that you speak to. I would imagine they weren't the first organization to do it, but perhaps were the first with the organizational heft that they did. Can you tell me a bit more about why the sort of the role of conspiracy theories in the John Birch Society and how it served their ideological purpose?
It was incredibly important for them. I mean, one of the best examples from the John Birch Society is the War on Christmas, right? So they created this flyer in the very beginnings of the John Birch Society saying that in department stores that all the Christmas trees were no longer going to have Christmas decorations. They were going to have UN insignias on it. And all of these women in the John Birch Society started sending in letters to like Macy's saying, I'm not going to stop at your store if this, or shop at your store if this happens. And they were like, like, sure, fine, it's not going to happen, but go ahead. And when it didn't happen, because there were no plans, they were like, we win. Yes, we're the best. We've got our first success against, this evil UN and communism that's happening. But, in 2026 and Christmas, we're going to see Starbucks and the war on Christmas again and Xing out Jesus, right? So this idea of protectionism and that there's an other trying to destroy religion, God, country, and family is really important. So, there was a lot of writings in their works about communists destroying the nuclear family, about anti-LGBTQ2SA materials, about male sons being more important than female sons, the submission of women, really shared amongst the women. And it was often because at the expense of, we don't know if the communist is living next door. We don't know if it is the person who's on our PTA. These ideas of schools taking over and harming your children, even saying, that they will, make the boys more effeminate and make the girls more emasculate. And that's very communistic ideas. So they would attack the schools and the reading lists that the schools had in the curriculums. Parents would go in and freak out and try and take books out of the libraries, join library boards, PTAs to take away communist books. So it was a mobilization technique, sometimes fighting against an enemy that didn't actually exist. And so there was this continuous sense of success for them because they had attained these things or they had fought these things. And so that mobilized them to do even more. For the Goldwater election, there is this theory that Robert Welch created called the insiders, which is his form of the Illuminati. And, he was saying that they were the ones who were in control of elections. And if you elected Goldwater, he was an outsider of this to these insiders, and that he could change everything. Sort of this idea, even though he had been, in politics forever, he was an outsider because of this idea he wasn't part of this internal group. And so this idea of fear and fighting against it, it creates this thing called a social hero, right? So an individual knows that if I say X about, communists in America, people are going to come back to me and say, oh, there's something wrong with you. You're being duped. You're not intelligent, or if you say something that is incorrect, they might try and get you fired or you'll lose your friends and family. But that just sort of validates the position because you're right. You expect this to happen and you're battling for the good, in this case, the eternal with the John Birch Society on the side of good. And when these things happen and come to pass, it proves that you're right. And so you're fighting evil, you're fighting this fear, and you're fighting against something. And that was really important in this book, in the way that the John Birch Society really approached the tiers, the socioeconomic tiers in the John Birch Society. The rich were fighting for their inheritance, right? That they have to have free enterprise, that they can have their companies or wealth. But the middle class and lower middle class people were fighting against this evil that was attacking the nation. And so fear is something that you fight against, right? You fight against these things and provide you a sense of control because you know the truth. So you can go and fight against this. That's absolutely used in mobilizations. We saw it not just with the John Birch, but what happens afterwards, right? With the moral majority. Tim LaHaye uses the idea of the Illuminati and fighting against it. And by electing Reagan, they beat the Illuminati at this one point in time. So it really is this sort of idea of success against things that may not necessarily exist, but it is a response of control for the things that you fear. And often it provides who the oppressor is or who the person who's causing the harm, right, in society. So the John Birch Society used it extremely well. Everyone looked to the very public things that Robert Welch said, but it was actually in the materials that were really important that they put out to stoke these ideas, like anti-Islam ideas. There are a lot of racist ideas were shared about who the enemies are and what's happening, and that mobilized the group to actually start electing and running for power themselves.
Right. And there's something, very inherently populist about conspiracy theories, right? Because you have the insiders or the elites or the deep state or the Illuminati, and then the people who are being shut out of the process. And it gives sort of explanatory power to, why most people, feel like they have no control over their lives or their communities or what have you. But with the JBS, another thing that was interesting about them, and that I think clearly ties into the present, is this fusion of economic liberalism and social
Mhm.
conservatism, which is, a defining feature of the neoconservative right, as well as the sort of new authoritarianism that has sort of grown out of that. Um, why was this alliance between business and religious interests important for the JBS, and why has it persisted to the present?
Well, for the John Birch Society, it stemmed out of something called the National Association of Manufacturers. Obviously, all the rich people who own companies, they did a survey and they found out that the three most powerful voices that shape people's opinions are youth, women, and religious leaders. And so they actually did this three-prong action PR campaign out to them to bring them in, and really showing that to them that there was hearts in manufacturing, right? And bringing the religious people in to understand that capitalism and free enterprise makes the world better for their congregations, for those who follow their faith. And so the John Birch Society brought that in as well. But, Christianity is not one great big blanket, right? There are different denominations with different dogma and different ideas. And the John Birch Society really worked on this idea of, okay, we're going to put our messaging out there that can respond to all ideas of religion about, when the end times are going to happen or how we perceive action on this realm. And so they balanced this thing, but it was really, communism this wasn't just the John Birch Society, that era, right? Communism was godless and America was God's country. So, there was an attack on religion by the godless communists. But what the John Birch did was they turned that a little bit and said, they're really trying to destroy your religion and they're trying to take away your traditions and your values. They really were what were the foundation of America as a Christian nation. And that Christianity, and predominantly white Christianity, built civilization. It built what we have in the Western world, was really the language that they often used. And so they didn't focus very overtly about differences in denomination and dogma, and really focused on traditions and values. And if I say a word to anyone in the audience like value or goodness or God, all of us will have a different definition of what those words mean, but we know that we need to fight for them. So people came together under that sort of umbrella. So we had Mormons working with Baptists, working with Catholics, working with evangelicals, all in the John Birch Society fighting for an equal cause. That was then translated into the moral majority that again really went under this values and traditions idea. We see it now today, right? Well, we're seeing a lot of schisms happening in that movement, but this idea of what tradition is, what values are, what are morals, what morality do we expect, how we treat women, how we treat the elderly and children, really are indoctrinated under this idea of values and traditions, even though everyone sees it a little bit different in their denominations. That was why it was so important. They linked the movement to saving your faith and saving the nation because it was a Christian nation, and their values and traditions became the marker of who was an American and who was not an American. So without using the words Christian nationalism, they were originally Christian nationalists.
And is there a sense in which the invocation of sort of the divine gives sort of a higher purpose to something that would otherwise just be materialistic and empty and inequitable?
Absolutely. So I think that when we were talking about earlier about this idea of oppression and who are the groups that are oppressing the conservatives, right? When you see a group as causing harm to you or your nation or your family or your religion, you start not having emotion towards them, right? You don't see them as being human. There's no commonalities that you can have with them. And so it's easier then for you to see them as lesser than you are or lesser than a human is, and that they deserve what is going to happen to them because what they've done to you. So then when we see populist leaders and Robert Welch using this language, it makes it okay almost to justify violence or justify policies that will remove their rights or their power or their control in society, because you're helping yourself, right? You're helping your nation. Now, when you see your nation as being a Christian nation, God has blessed it, right? God helped you create, and it was based on God's rules and morality and values that made this happen. So you feel yourself being on the side of the eternal, on the good, fighting against this evil. That evil may come in many forms of immorality. It could be sexuality, it could be laws, it could be policies, it could be actions. Inclusivity, equality are all attacks on God's values and morals. And so by using this language by the John Birch Society and organizations that came afterwards, it's really important in the mobilization, because you're a hero fighting for God, and how you understand your religion.
Now, given the JBS's dedication to upholding traditional social relations, some people might find it counterintuitive that women played a major role in mobilizing support for this agenda. You have an entire chapter in the book dedicated to the role of women in the JBS. Tell us a bit about their function within the John Birch Society ecosystem.
They were incredibly important. I mean, first of all, women at that point in time, a lot of them were not working in the 1950s and 60s, right? So they had the power of shaping society, shaping opinions. They could do get out the vote actions. They could do the mailing and the protesting and all of the actions that the John Birch Society needed, and the political parties as well. But there were a lot of women who earnestly believed in this idea of submission, of being at home. I mean, even Phyllis Schlafly, who is a very famous John Birch Society member, very famous against the Equal Rights Amendment in America, she ran for politics in America and said, I make sure I come home every night, and that my children were old enough before I did it, and it's more of a hobby. Her husband was the one who contacted Ronald Goldwater's party and election campaign and said, my wife wrote a book that might be important to your campaign. And it became the most powerful book for his movement. And so there's this very submissive traditionalist notion that's there. With the men in the John Birch Society, there was a split in the way that they promoted their ideas and their movement. With the men, it was about empowering them, being the heroes that are going to fight against this, almost like warriors, very masculine kind of entities that they were trying to create. But with the women, they were trying to create this sense of family and friendship. So the women would write books about, how you can support your man and what he's doing in this fight against communism and the actions that you could do. And so women were, and I think beliefs still are, more than 50% of the population in America. So if you can get that many women to say, yeah, I'm going to vote for this Republican candidate who represents my very conservative, traditionalist, religious views, that can have a huge impact on the election of one of those individuals if women all come out. So they were smart enough to know that they needed to get that women's votes out there in support of their cause and what they were looking for. So they made very specific advances into bringing women into the fold. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. In these writings, JBS co-founder Robert Welch pioneered this concept of Americanism. What is Americanism, and what purpose did it serve in mobilizing people around the JBS's broader social project?
Americanism for Robert Welch was really this idea of it wasn't bounded by a border in any way. It was really an ideology about capitalism, free enterprise, religion, Christianity coming together and fighting for the forces for good, being successful, being, a national republic, being all of these things. So it wasn't by the border. It was something that they wanted to actually spread around the world. This movement of people who were fighting against ideologies of communism that were really empowered by God and by this American dream type of attack to free enterprise and success. And so for him, he would use this and, used John Birch, the person who was the organization was named after, really is this idea of something that fought for the good of humanity as they understood it, capitalism and God. And so he tried to spread this idea, and it wasn't just him. A lot of talk radio hosts at the time that were also involved with the John Birch Society, like Dan Smoot and Clarence Mannion, they all used this term to sort of explain this movement that was going forward to spread capitalism and God.
And tell us a bit about the figure of John Birch, because as you make pretty clear in the book, Welch played a little fast and loose with his history, and it was somewhat controversial even within the movement.
Absolutely. So the story that Robert Welch created was that John Birch, who is an actual individual, was in the war. He was very Christian. His family were Christian. He was a missionary. And during World War II, apparently at the end, when the war had ended, he was going through China, and Chinese soldiers attacked him and his men, and he was fighting against them, and they killed him and another individual and kidnapped the rest of the people. Robert Welch created this story that the FBI had hidden the story of John Birch from the American people so people wouldn't rise up and another war would begin. He also claimed that when John Birch was dying, that he saw, the end of the world happening, the apocalypse, and knew that, the world had to fight for God at this point. The thing was, to be typically me, it was bullshit. John Birch did exist. He did get killed by Chinese soldiers, but it was because he was being absolutely arrogant and, verbally attacking Chinese soldiers, saying that if they didn't do what he wanted, America would drop a nuclear bomb on them. And the soldiers attacked. The ones who survived came back and said, whoa, no, he's not a hero. He was actually the one who did this. One of the people who were on the National Council for the John Birch Society, a general, said, you can't tell the story. This isn't right. It's wrong. And Robert Welch said, no, I'm doing it. And that general actually backed out of the National Council and the John Birch Society. Now, this story, he wrote a book about it. It was a cornerstone of what the John Birch Society was. That individual became the Americanist hero, right? Who everyone in the John Birch Society should be, fighting for Americanism. Eventually, the story came out in, I believe, the Washington Post, about what it was. And yet, it's 2026. And if you go to John Birch Society's Telegram, they're still going on about this hero Christian who tried to fight for America. So even though the truth was out there, those who are involved in this just don't see that truth. They just really want to be a part of this myth that Welch has created.
Right. He's sort of transformed into this mythological martyr-like figure when the reality is a lot more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, his parents, even after 1964, when the John Birch started going down, they would still go out and write all these letters in support of the John Birch Society. And, they would give them awards and bring them out to talking and rally events and stuff. They really became a part of the myth themselves for the John Birch Society.
Mm-hmm. And now I wanted to go back to the Goldwater campaign because you outlined this very interesting dynamic in which the JBS supported Goldwater as their sort of, prophetic leader. They mobilized volunteers and donors on behalf, but Goldwater himself had to keep some distance from the society. And you described the JBS as a hindrance and benefit for the Goldwater campaign. What does this tell us about the relationship between far right populist activism and electoral politics?
Tells us a lot. I think that, with the John Birch Society, Robert Welch became an albatross around Goldwater's neck, right? The things he had said about Eisenhower, his conspiracy theories became very problematic. And Goldwater was linked to that. And not just because the John Birch Society had supported him, but because he'd been writing for Human Events, had been engaged with the John Birch Society. And a lot of their funders were his funders. And so the people in the background are very important to politicians when it comes to populist leaders because they fund it. They help support the ideas in the movement. But they also need the electorate to vote, right? I mean, a lot of, rich people can all say, we want X to happen. But in a democracy, we need the votes. So Goldwater had to balance this idea of looking at, we need the John Birch members to vote for me, but I'm never going to get a moderate or a centrist to vote for me because they're going to link me to this extremism, to these conspiracy theories, and to these ideas. It tells us a lot about populism in the movements because those conspiracy theories and extremist ideas are really what motivate populism, right? Here is a problem, let me solve it for you as your populist leader, regardless if it's a true problem or not a true problem. But you have to be careful if you need that to expand outside of that base. If we put it into context of 2024 and we look at Donald Trump, he already had his base of those that we could presume to be involved in conspiracy theories and extremism. But the way to get a greater base so he could actually win was to go on podcasts like Joe Rogan and engage people who may not necessarily support everything that Donald Trump and the extremists were supporting, but could answer some of their problems, right? So the issues that, white men are articulating, he could really feed into that. And, with Donald Trump, it was also the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. And so looking at immigration and why young white men are not as employed or feel that they're not getting the jobs that they want. So there is this populishness that you have to take away sometimes the loudest individuals. I mean, who could cause you problems with the moderate vote or the centralists, but you also have to appeal to them in some way, which I don't think Goldwater was able to do. He was so labeled as being involved with the extremists and the conspiracy theories that he couldn't get the moderate vote, and it was very easy for the Democratic Party to attack him in that.
In, I think, the penultimate chapter of the book, you sort of go through, okay, after Goldwater, here is where the JBS was able to exert influence without being as overt, perhaps, as it was before. Right? Nixon rolls back some civil rights protections, and then you get to Reagan and the rise of this moral majority. So, tell us a bit about how the John Birch Society influence and shape the moral majority, and how the moral majority in turn influenced the Reagan administration.
Well, the moral majority was started by an individual named Paul Weyrich and Howard Phillips and Jerry Falwell and Tim LaHaye. Tim LaHaye was very much involved in the John Birch Society. He was a representative for the Christians, or was in videos. In his book, he claims that he was there and gave Christ to Robert Welch before he died. Tim LaHaye used a lot of the techniques that were involved in the John Birch Society, right? With fear, religion. Instead of using the word communism, he used the word humanists as who this specter or nebulous enemy was. These individuals came together and said, well, Paul Weyrich had been involved with writing with the John Birch Society, had been a speaker for them, and had been very much involved in the Goldwater campaign. So was Howard Phillips. And they came together with Falwell, and they knew that they could mobilize Christians to vote. And they just didn't have the social capital to do that. But Falwell did. And so they went to him, and in a conversation, Weyrich actually said, if we could mobilize the moral majority, we could elect a conservative leader. And that's how the title actually came about. Now, those individuals also used a lot of the funders of the John Birch Society as part of this moral majority movement. They used conspiracy theories. They used fear. They used, who we need to attack to mobilize people to vote for Christian values. Now, Wayrick was very much involved in this idea of anti-LGBTQ, anti-women's rights, very much involved in this sort of moral panics we see now about sexuality, about women having children and staying home and not being in the workplace. And so he really used those sort of culture war issues that the John Birch Society had used in their movement to mobilize people to fight for God, country, and family. But the difference was it was inverted, right? So the John Birch Society kept their membership completely secret. There were little cells all over America, and no one knew how many members they actually had or who was a member. And the leadership, the National Council of the John Birch Society, was very vocal and very out there and said, here are our funders, here are all of our things that are trying to make this happen. With the moral majority, we saw the shift where the public could openly say, well, I'm a Christian and I'm voting for the morals and values of America. And the funders, other than, Jerry Falwell's televangelism movement, were really in the background. And so there was no sort of like bigger hand that was coming down to organize this. It was people very vocal saying, I'm voting for this and this is why. And so they were able to take what Robert Welsh had started, inverted it a little, still gave them fears, still gave them a reason to fight for something, still made it very religious, and gave them conspiracy theories to mobilize them for a political leader.
And you mentioned Paul Weyrich. You draw a direct line in the book between the JBS, where Weyrich got his start, and the Heritage Foundation, which was co-founded by Weyrich. Listeners might be familiar with it as the organization that produced Project 2025, this sort of blueprint for corporate authoritarianism that Trump is implementing significant parts of as we speak. Similar to my question about the moral majority, what were the similarities and differences between what the JBS was doing, and I guess is still doing because it's technically around, and the Heritage Foundation?
Well, I think what Raywick wanted to do when he created the Heritage Foundation was really create a foundation that he saw happening a lot on the left wing with the Democrat Party, but could also give congresspeople and senators information about causes before they voted, give them the conservative ideal. And so he created this where he could also have individuals who may move up in the ranks to actually become conservative politicians or aides or working within within government. But they were really focused in the first few years about economics, right? So making a smaller government, less taxation, more freedom for free enterprise. Weyrich himself was far more involved in the social conservatism and the culture war issues. So he actually left the Heritage Foundation to start his own group so that way he could focus more on these ideas about culture war issues and Christianity in America. But the Heritage Foundation was sponsored by the very same people who sponsored the John Birch Society. So he worked with the Coors beer company, who was very supportive of the John Birch Society and many of the right-wing organizations. He worked with the Bradley Foundation, which also is foundational in starting the John Birch Society. The Scape Foundation, also very foundational in starting the John Birch Society. Those same individuals supported this conservative movement that was working specifically on the government, right? So they wanted to have an impact on the votes and ensure that there was this conservative idea that was being shared. Now, Weyrich left, as I said, because he wanted to have more of a social impact. And in his own organizations, he tried to almost create the same movement that the Heritage Foundation was doing, but focusing on social issues and culture issues. In the 1993, they switched over and they started including these issues into their mandate for leadership that they would give to Republican leaders under this idea that when they walked into their position as president, they would have all these policies in front of them, that they wouldn't take 6 months to sort of catch up to speed about how all of this works. So they could institute it instantaneously, these ideas. Now, mandate for leadership, Ronald Reagan took it and instituted I believe 60% in his first term. And those policies were very much important to the economics. But a lot of the people who voted for Ronald Reagan were upset because they had voted for him for social issues, right? They had voted for him to end abortion, for him to take away rights for LGBTQ, to, especially during the AIDS epidemic. They just didn't want to engage with any of that. And they wanted to take away rights from people of color and, women's rights to work, birth control, pornography. All of these things were things that they had voted for Reagan for, which he did not address. And so a lot of the new right actually pulled away from that. So Weyrich was foundational in the mandate for leadership for the start of the Heritage Foundation, but it took some time before he actually got what he wanted through the Heritage Foundation and the mandate for leadership, or Project 2025 in our case.
And now we've been talking about the influence of the JBS and its, antecedents on American conservatism, but we're both in Canada, and you research a lot into the Canadian far right, and I'm wondering what influence you see here north of the 49th parallel.
The John Birch Society did have a lot of influence in the 1960s here in Canada. They actually had branches over here and were trying to engage in that idea. But a lot of the techniques that are being used by the organization, by the John Birch Society, we can see playing here too, right? We see the use of conspiracy theories. We see Christian nationalism happening here. With the 51st state concept, there are Maple MAGA that want that idea here in Canada as well. We see a lot of groups where I am in Toronto who have rallies. The idea of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which is that immigration and people of color will replace white people and destroy Western civilization, is foundational to so much of these movements that we're seeing here in Canada as well. So, I think that when the John Birch Society was around in the 1960s, we were very powerful in the 1960s. Talk radio and stuff really wasn't coming up here, and some of their materials, their printed materials, were coming to Canada. But I think the techniques, especially now that we have the internet, that there are no borders, and the conspiracy theories. I mean, QAnon is not just an American, institution. It is around the world. So these ideas that have been threaded, that many came from the John Birch Society, of infiltration of the government, of the deep state now, or the woke instead of the humanists or the communists, really are pushed by what we're seeing with talk radio, what we're seeing with podcasts, what we're seeing with forums and social media, are really instituting this movement for a populist leader to engage with it. We see this here in Canada. There are certain politicians who are very much articulating, the end of DEI, the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, attacks on LGBTQ and women's rights. So this populist idea and the way that it was spread is very much inherent here in Canada and our populist movements as well.
Thanks so much for joining me this afternoon, Carmen. The book is God's Angry Men. Where can people find it?
You can get it at Chapters, Amazon, or from Bloomsbury's site as well.
Mm-hmm. And where can people keep up with your work?
You can go to my website, carmencelestini.com. I also have a Substack that I write 2 or 3 times a week about conspiracy theories, populism, and the far right here in Canada and the United States.
Great. I will definitely include links to those in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and take care out there.